Hi, welcome to Chat with Sonlight. Like Sonlight's curriculum offerings, we will explore homeschooling through the lens of a literature-based, Christ-centered education. Join us for everything you might be interested in for organizing your homeschool, connecting with others, and details on literature-based learning, and maybe a few sneak peeks. Hello and welcome to today's Chat with Sonlight. As a homeschool mom, I appreciate the science videos for my kids to watch along with the experiments. There are always weeks that pulling everything out when scheduled did not work for us, but letting the kids watch the experiment was as it was scheduled fit my checkbox mentality, and they could pull everything out on the weekend when my husband could help them. It is hard to believe that it was about 14 years ago that Sonlight started to include Discover and Do in their science packages. I remember my boys and watching the DVD back to back, trying to talk me into doing them all at once. So I've invited the InquisiKids Film Team to join me here and get to know them and learn more about InquisiKids and what it takes to make these awesome science videos. Guys, can you introduce yourselves and tell us a little about yourselves?
I am Luke, and I have been making educational videos for a long time. I actually helped make the very first educational videos that you were talking about just a minute ago. I was part of that team. I was behind the camera at that time. Now I am in front of the camera doing a lot of the presentation, but I also do a lot of the post-production work. So I do a lot of the editing and help with writing and that kind of stuff as well. So that's what I do. I'm very passionate about education, and I do not just science videos. I do a bunch of other stuff personally for fun and education, both within film and theology and a bunch of other stuff. That's all personal stuff. As far as professionally, yeah, what I'm doing right now, science videos.
And I'm Jonathan. I have not been doing education videos as long as Luke has, not even close. But I do have a background in film. I went to film school. I have always loved movies, always want to get into that. And doing education is actually a really nice kind of coalescing of different interests of mine. So I love the fact that I get to be behind the camera in this case and help Luke be an awesome star for this education program.
Now, of course, Jonathan does show up on camera, but often with wigs. So I don't know if you can recognize him or not, but yeah.
It's true. I do show up occasionally. I also write a lot. I love writing when we get a chance to do that. And there's a lot of things we do behind the scenes. But yes, I am primarily behind the camera, but you do see me perhaps as Chili Man or something else like that. Who knows?
So let me ask you guys, is coming out with one of these episodes as easy as reading the experiment and just putting it on screen and doing it?
No. No, it is not.
No.
No.
Tell us more. Tell us more. What goes into making one of these episodes?
So the process really begins with several different steps. Obviously, first, the content has to be created. And since we're part of InquisiKids here, there is the entire process of creating the InquisiKids science books in the first place and all the work that's gone into there. I've been part of helping do a little bit of that work here and there way back in the day, years ago now. But now what happens is we get the book and then we look through the book and we start breaking down what that is. And Jonathan actually started this process and he was talking about writing. So I'm gonna let Jonathan talk about what is it like to kind of break down a chapter for a script.
Right. Back in something like the K level, we would look at an experiment and I would just read it. That's the first thing you do. You look at the book, you read it, try to understand what's happening here, what's being taught, and what does this entail? What's this experiment going to actually do? What's it supposed to do? What are the questions involved? What are we trying to learn? You start there and then you start saying, okay, well, this is a great experiment. And as a writer, I'm thinking, how do I contextualize this for Luke as a character? Not just Luke, the person I know who I love and hang out with and do things with, but as a character. Why would the Luke character be experimenting about this? Why would he be doing any of these things? And we ask the questions and say, okay, well, maybe his friend has a dog and he tried to make the water cold. And so he put the thing in the freezer and it froze, but he doesn't want that to happen. He wants to instead insulate that and make that not freeze in the freezer. And it's just it's silly. It's a little reaching at times, but we're trying to find some way, some relationship, some character, some story reason to make there be a reason for the Luke character to then engage in the experiment. And that gives us a nice intro. And from that point, it's very much following the book as far as, okay, so how do we actually do this? How do we experiment? How do we figure this out? How do we find out whether or not this actually freezes, et cetera, all leading back to okay, now that we set something up at the beginning, like this freeze woof idea that we come up with. Let's pay that off. Let's have a joke. Let's be silly. Not take too long, but let's just pay that off and see how that actually affected everybody. So that's kind of the general mentality taken when it comes to the writing of it, of what's the context? What's the reason to do this? And then the rest of it is what's the most efficient, best way to help our customers and anyone trying to do this experiment well.
And then from the script stage, then you have to go through and you have to break down that script and you have to say, okay, what do we need then to shoot this thing? If we need a freeze woof, then we need a dog bowl that we can then use to film with, right? And then you have to get all the props together and you have to do that. You also figure out where are we going to be shooting this? We shoot a lot of stuff in the Discover and Do room, or the D&D room as we like to call it, or we might end up in a kitchen. But also if we're going to have somebody come over with a need because they have the frozen dog bowl, well then, oh man, well then we're going to need to be at the front door. Okay, so now we're there. And then, okay, where else are we going to have to be? So you kind of have to figure out what you're shooting, what you need to shoot it, and you have to gather up all those supplies. That's part of the kind of pre-production side of everything. And then we actually get to filming, where we actually sit down and I have to memorize my lines or what I'm going to say. We have to figure out the order I'm going to say it in. And then we have to figure out how we're going to shoot it. Okay, so it's going to be a wide shot. How far do I have to go where it sounds like I'm saying all the same, all the right stuff for a long time until, okay, now we're going to cut to look down at whatever it is. And for that, we actually have multiple pieces of technology.
That's not, of course, like there's so much that goes into this. So for instance, anytime that we are in what we lovingly call the Discover and Do room, the D&D room, that is a set that we set up, and we had to light that entire set. We had to set up a desk for the Luke character to be at. We had to make sure all that looks very pretty. We want this to be a nice, visually pleasing experience. And that took a long time. That one set took us not in actual like work hours, 40 hours a week trying to figure this out, but it took us a long time for a couple months to paint the room and set up the decorations, get the right bookcases in there, get the right props in there, just make sure it's a really nice environment that we could use well for any experiment that came our way. And that's the kind of interest that we, the kind of time we spend on lighting a set like that we know that we're going to come back to over and over and over again. It's kind of a home base for us. Then there's things like the doorway where, there's the sun outside and we're not going to try to light, the doorway all the time. We only come there occasionally. So we go on a location and we're going to shoot. So we bring lights with us and we bring a camera and we're trying to figure out with the sun and with the lights and what we have, how do we light that? So any setup, anytime we do anything visually, we have to consider the camera, we have to consider the lighting of the situation, not to mention, as Luke said, the props and the scheduling of anybody else who might have to be in that scene, of course, memorizing the lines. All of that has to be taken into consideration when we go anywhere. But again, some of that other stuff, some of those home-based areas, we spend a long time before we even get to pre-production on experiments to make sure that's a great home base for us.
And then while we're filming in the home base, in the Discover and Do room, we have 3 cameras running now and 2 audio sources, which Jonathan has to manage for all of that kind of stuff. Then we shoot it, and we shoot it multiple times. We take it as many times as we need to make me sound like I've got it. If I said something wrong, if it didn't quite work right, or if, okay, we need to go back and refocus on that thing, or, oh, we need to get a close up of this shot because we weren't able to get it in that take. We kind of do that multiple times. From there, we take all of that footage and we bring it to editing, which is what I then take, and we synchronize all of the sound and the picture, and then we pulled it into a timeline and we cut all the stuff together. We also have special effects with the frame of the past. I hold up a little frame to show video, and we had very specific philosophical, educational approaches to what we were doing. When we were doing kindergarten, it was very important for me that we were not building a video type that was really flashy and going to distract kids and, kind of deal with that kind of stuff. Instead, we wanted to focus on the great education of people like Mr. Rogers, where he slowed things down and had it all be physically proper and real. And so the frame of the past was a way for us to get visuals that we wanted to show people into the set so that you could actually physically see it there. And so there's special effects with that. And so I cut all of that together and I focus primarily on audio so that I make certain that it sounds like I know what I'm talking about and all of my flubs are covered up. And then I cut the visual to make it look right at that point in time. See, there were some flubs right there. And if we were cutting this, I would have fixed all that. But we can't do that right now because we just got 1 camera. Whereas that's the benefit of having 3 when we're doing that. So then we go from picture and getting that all locked and all the visual effects and all that stuff and sound effects, and we pass it over to Jonathan.
Right. And there, my main job is to make sure that, as Luke has done a good job in editing to making sure that all the content, all the flubs are not there and everything is clear and concise, My job is to help out with transitions in audio that hopefully no one will ever know about, because that's one of my jobs, to make sure that there's no mistakes that you can never hear. So we want his dialogue to be intelligible and clear. We want to make sure any sound effects are mixed properly. I want to make sure there's some good music here and there. There's some times where we're building and it's just nice to have a little something that gets you going and get into the mood of moving your body and building something itself. Also, when we have intros and special events like that, we want to make sure the music, comes alongside, kind of like score for a movie, just anything to help supplement what we're doing. But like Luke said, there's this overarching philosophy of being grounded. And I would say also, we talked a lot about it. And one of the things we talked about is we can be fantastical. That's actually okay. We can be fantastical, we can be silly, but we want to be very clear about this is fantastical and this is silly. This is grounded and this is real, especially when you're dealing with something like education and science. We don't want to make science seem like it's all just fantastical. We want to make sure you understand this is real, this is grounded. This over here, this is silly, this is for fun. And these can all interact in the same world as long as we are clear about it. So even when it comes to sound or to music or to sound effects, we want to make sure that things come alive and can have a fantasticalness to them, but we also need to sometimes dial it all back and let Luke just talk and just let it be real and grounded and, in a sense, a little dry, but it lets you focus. And having the ebb and flow between those two things, music and building and fun, and a little bit more serious, a little bit more, let's focus on the dialogue, allows you to not get, hopefully, not bored or miss any important information.
And science is just fantastic. So we want to get that across as well as we go along. So that was one way that we built films and videos. The other way that we build videos now, as we're moving into second grade and beyond, is we are now just focusing on the experiment. Writing scripts and taking all the time to build out all that stuff takes a lot of time. So now what we're focusing on is just getting right to the experiment. So we just say, this is what we're doing today, and here we go. And then we just show you all the details with that. So it's a very different approach, but it is no less work in one sense, because we still have to go to the book. We have to figure out what the outline of all of those ideas are. Then I have to kind of organize those in a way that I think makes sense, because I'm going to be doing this from my head. I'm no longer relying on a script that Jonathan has written for me like we did in the past. Now I have to do an outline. And so I rearrange the content in the book so that it makes sense for me. Then I lay out all of the things that I'm going to need to use for this experiment in an order. So I know I'm going to grab this, I'm going to do this and that. And then I basically say what I'm doing as I talk along. And we rely very heavily on editing to make it so that I sound a lot smarter than I am as I'm working through that stuff. And then we build the whole thing, do all of it, kind of give a summary of what that is. And then we are done. And typically we shoot that in one and maybe 1.5 takes where you have to go back and do something, unless the entire thing falls apart, in which case we kind of have to start over with things. And so as we shoot through that stuff, sometimes, the experiment will take 45 minutes to shoot, or in the case of growing things, it could take weeks for things to grow. So we have to grow everything ahead of time so that when we come in film, I can just reach over and grab the next plant that has grown and say, this is what it looks like after a week. And this is what it looks like after a month. And what's beautiful about that is that helps parents who are busy, who might not have a chance to grow plants, or maybe the plants didn't survive for a full month, to be able to see what that is, and their kids can still experience it, even as stuff is not quite working out the way that they want. So that is another way that we approach production that's kind of different, that's much more ad-libbing and requires very heavy editing to make me sound like I'm saying exactly what we need to be saying, even going back and recording dialogue after the fact, where I wasn't able to cut this in a way that made sense. So what am I supposed to say at this point in time? So those are kind of the two main approaches to production, but both require a tremendous amount of work.
I was going to say about the plants, as a parent, we appreciate you doing the stages. As 50% of the time the plants don't grow, but if you're like me, they don't grow anyway. So that's the way my life is. I can buy plastic and it still will die. So guys, tell me 2 things. One, can you both tell me maybe what your favorite episode was to ever do? I can tell you one of my favorite ones from the kindergarten. My youngest, who's now graduate, he taught the kindergarten at our co-op. So we bought the curriculum and but I loved the bees where you guys went running around, because every time he taught it, I could go stand outside and watch all the kindergartners run all over the football field doing that experiment. And I thought it was great, but you did a wonderful job just doing the whole process. And I was like, that's a lot of work. I bet they're worn out after filming that one.
There was a lot. That was one where I actually was running a lot. Yeah, we did several shots where I'm just running off into the distance and then coming back. And that's when I was like, okay, I'm no longer in the shape that I was once when I was a cross country runner. Like, just I'm not here anymore. But that one was fun, and it highlights one of the things that I really like with the scripted versions, which is where we put in a lot of puns and alliteration and other kind of literary joke type things that we tried to put in. So I like that one for that reason. Man, there are so many good ones. I think one of the ones that we show off the most when we do stuff is reptile eggs, because we did so many crazy things with that. Not only were there some excellent puns throughout that particular video, but we also just did a lot. We ended up having to go back and add time travel to the experiment because we had something mess up. And so we had to go back instead of reshooting the whole thing, just add this element to it. But what was great is that the script already had us doing a joke, a visual gag relating to Back to the Future. So we already had that in there. And so there's like this meta layer of joking that's going on throughout that entire video. And there is a ton in that one. But I think a favorite that customers really just love is cake. There isn't that much science behind it because it's kindergarten and it's just like, hey, here's chocolate. But we did a very fun song, little dance bit in that one. That's really it's just for fun. And it's a lot of fun. And if that gets kids interested in science, because like, this is great. And that was actually inspired by the Muppets popcorn gag, if you haven't watched that. So that's where we got our inspiration to then go make our own. And that is, by the way, original music made by Jonathan.
That's correct. And you're right. Look, there's so many to choose from, especially the K level. There's a lot of fun things we did. And you've all brought up really great episodes that I love for different reasons. If I have to choose another one that's different than that, I might choose something like, I forget what the actual experiment is, but I remember that it has to do with growing. And it was the chili cook-off, was where we tied all of things. We had a Chili Man character. Yes, I played that character. I have an affinity to that character. But what we did is we had a whole little subplot going on the entire K level of, there's this chili man and he needs to grow beans for his chili to make his special thing to win the chili cook-off. And in that one episode, we finally got to the point where, it's right, it's greenhouses. We had to see if we could grow beans, during the greenhouse stage, while it's kind of cold and wintry outside. And so that was a lot of fun to shoot and a lot of fun to see that come together and kind of pay off little subplot side characters, which, it's an education curriculum, and I never expected that we would be able to have subplots and side characters, that we would have little arcs and actually pay that off. So I really appreciate that we were able to pull that off.
And I will say that for my daughter, Perry, anything with Perry is her favorite. She just loves Perry the Puppet Parrot. And then when we get to first grade, I do love Chili Man, but then we also introduced Trivia Man. And then there's one where we're dealing with twins and why do people look, and like what we were able to pull off for that episode is just awesome. And it just came together so very well. We worked for it. We had contingencies if it wasn't going to work, but it worked so seamlessly and with relatively low effort. It was just so impressive. That's, I think, one of my favorite, when we have Chili Man and Trivia Man in the same shot together in first grade. That's just a highlight of production, with also just education and other fun stuff that's going on, and the comedy's there, which is all just gold.
Yeah, we like that one. We like a lot of things. Anyway, yes. What else we on?
Well, I was going to ask what else. So tell me, what does InquisiKids have new coming out? Is there anything new?
Oh yeah, there's more stuff that's new. I can't talk about any of it because we're still working on it. And there's nothing to say, hey, this is where it's going to be with anything. So I can't talk about specifics of the things that we're working on. I did mention second, so I guess there's that. But no, there's nothing new that I can talk about as far as that. We are working on things though. Absolutely.
Does InquisiKids do anything besides science videos?
Yes, there's other stuff that InquisiKids has. We've got a podcast that other people write. So when people are like, man, this podcast is so great, that's the writers. I just record it. And I struggle with recording it because there's a whole lot of words that I don't know how to pronounce. And so I am sorry for anybody who is listening along with that podcast. I'm like, that's not how you say that word. It's that you're probably right about that. I don't know how to pronounce it. I look things up online. I can't find it. So I do that. That's one of the things that's out there is the InquisiKids Daily Podcast. But there's also things like hands-on kits, and there's also lap books so that you can follow along with your history and have something really fun if you're into that. One of my daughters is very much into worksheets and that kind of stuff. I think she's going to be really into that kind of stuff. Whereas it could be that my other daughter's more into the hands-on kits, building things and just putting stuff together. So there's stuff for kids depending on what they're interested in.
Right. Well, I thank you guys. Is there anything else you want to add for today?
I mean, science is great. Education is great. And so keep going and keep learning because there's always more to learn.
Exclamations.
Exclamation. Well, I will add in the links to the InquisiKid podcast, to the links of our podcast here, as well as I believe there's a free science experiment that can be downloaded. So I will put those links into our podcast, and I invite you guys to get to know InquisiKids more. Thank you for joining us today. Do you have an idea for a podcast topic, or do you want to chat with Sonlight on an upcoming episode? Email us at connections@sonlight.com.